can I get you guys to introduce yourselves and tell me kind of what's your kind of gut feeling now about the reforms in the industry, and what are you most worried about? Start with you, Bex.
Thanks. So, hi, I'm Bex. I'm the head of development at Field. Field is a UK-based developer, owner, operator, and now optimizer of battery storage. We have sites in construction, we have sites in operation, and we have a large pipeline in development. And I think in terms of our business model, the owner-operator part is particularly relevant to these discussions, because when we're talking about commitments, so if they're financial security payments, that's us who's paying them. Okay, so then that's our sort of skin in the game. And then what does Gate 2 mean to us? So a bit of audience participation first. Honestly, hands up, who thinks Gate 2 is going to go well for them in the audience? I'm very pleased for the man on the front row. Yeah, so us two, basically. And that's not for lack of trying, right? We have lived and breathed through the connections reform. We've done our own analysis, we've engaged, and we've lobbied. And that's because we think, because of the speed over which this has been developed, there's errors in the methodology that are ultimately going to jeopardize its aim. So, as Ali said, and as a recap, the aim is an accelerated grid connections queue for a system that's aligned with the GB energy system's need. Okay, so to put that into, I'll come back to sort of those errors and how I think they manifest at the end, but to put that into context, I'm going to tell you a story about one of our own greenfield development projects. So our approach to greenfield development starts with grid analysis. So where is the real system need, but also looking at constructability. So an existing substation with a spare bay, perfect. So I've identified our grid connection point, and then the grid and the land streams run in parallel. So when we started this project, our aim was we want warm, fuzzy feelings from a landowner before putting in a grid connection. And that matches with the current position now, where you need a landowner letter of approval before submitting a grid application. And it was Field who sat here a year ago and said, you've got to have some kind of permission from a landowner before putting in a grid application. Okay, so we've got exclusive land rights, we've put in our grid application. We then accept the grid offer, which comes with an £1,000 per megawatt financial security payment. So this is a 200 megawatt scheme, so we're putting down £200,000. Fine, we're in it. It's also worth noting that those financial securities increase year on year. So over the course of this project, we then put down the next one a year later. Development takes quite a long time. So we've put down £400,000. And we were ready to put down another £200,000 in the upcoming payments due in March, but they've been cancelled, something I'll come back to again in my conclusions. Okay, so we've got grid and we've got land, and then what else is going on from a development point of view? We did some early ground investigations. The site's got a bit of a gradient. We wanted to make sure that this really is a constructible, viable site. And only after all of that do we start, we've de-risked the project, and we start on planning. So the project is now at planning submitted stage, and that's where it will be when Gate 2 to the whole queue assessment is done in May. Okay, so why have I told you all of that story? We've spent nearly £1 million on this project. These are £100 million CapEx projects. I don't think anyone in the audience would say we've done the wrong thing or would do things differently. And yet, as it stands, we may just have to down tools on this project because it's not going to get a Gate 2 offer, or unlikely to get a Gate 2 offer. So then just to sort of wrap that up and where I think the errors are in the process that have led to this, we've seen high-level decisions mandated based on arbitrary zonal capacity maps that don't consider system needs. So that's point one. Point two is, I think, the process is wrongly incentivized at every stage. Why were the upcoming grid security payments cancelled? Why has the financial commitment milestones commitment been massively watered down? If you want to see who's staying in the queue, make them pay for it. And then finally, I think using planning status and counter-signature dates for grids doesn't demonstrate readiness. Or if it does, it definitely doesn't take into account deliverability, viability, or system need.
Thanks, Bex. That was a good summary. John, what's your view?
Yeah, thanks. John Sturman, I'm the Managing Director of NatPower UK. We are, by quite a margin, the largest battery storage developer in the country. We're looking to deliver the largest assets with the longest duration. So a typical asset for us would be a 1 gigawatt transmission connected 4-hour system. So we've got quite a number of those across the UK in development at the moment. So when it comes to grid reform, I fully support all of the comments that have just been made. When you look at grid reform, I've got a few comments that I think are quite pertinent. With the reform as it currently stands, obviously I think everybody recognises we've got to get rid of the speculators from the grid queue, and there are a lot of them. And I think the reason for that was it was very easy for speculators to jump into battery storage where you only needed a couple of acres of land to get a land deal, put a grid application in, particularly at DNO level, costs you a few £1,000s, and then you can flip the project, and you're not going to deliver that project. So our estimation is that under current grid reform, there is still going to be a significant number of parties holding grid connections that have no intention of delivering the projects. And they will be looking to flip those projects with no real appreciation of how you get to financial close. So that's the first comment. Second thing is where we're at the moment. If you look at the zonal capacities, we don't agree that it was for NESO to get involved in submitting zonal capacities. For us, that's market interference. You should let the market decide in terms of where projects go. Particularly developers, they know where you can realise a project, which projects you can get to financial close regionally, etc. So setting zonal capacities for us was a bit too much market interference. Equally, to reiterate, I think I would question why did we lose the initial proposal of £20,000 a megawatt as a financial commitment? Because that would definitely deliver projects with grid connections that will end up being built. Equally, we're facing right now with current grid reform all of the grid connections being taken up by almost exclusively 2-hour systems and smaller projects. And that's the zonal capacities maxed out probably by the end of this year until 2035. And that does not deliver a battery storage network that the overall network needs out to 2035, especially under CP30. So there's no allowance made whatsoever in grid reform to enable larger assets with longer duration storage. And that's what the customer needs for keeping costs down. And it's what the network needs as well. So we are baking in a network of battery storage assets, which will be baked in by the end of this year, out to 2035, of just 2-hour systems and a majority of small projects.
Thanks, John. Oonagh, you come from a different perspective, thinking about long duration storage. Do you want to give us your view?
Yeah, sure. So lovely to be here. My name is Oonagh Grady. I'm VP of International Origination for Hydrostor. Hydrostor is a Canadian company, Canadian-based company, and a leading technology and developer of long-duration energy storage. While we are, some would say, a new entrant to the UK market, we do have over 700 megawatts of advanced projects in mature LDES markets of New South Wales in Australia and California in the US. Both of those projects are approaching financial investment decision, and with those projects and having been successful in the LTESA scheme, which is the equivalent of the long duration energy storage cap and floor scheme here in the UK, we have signed the largest energy storage contracts in the world. On a personal note, I am probably a gamekeeper turned poacher in the fact that I spent 5 years in Airgrid in Ireland on grid reform policy. So I definitely see it from both sides. I would absolutely support exactly what Beck has said with regards to the uncertainty this brings into development. That's not only from a new entrants perspective, but your grid is your cornerstone of all your site-specific works from there on in. And I think that the first thing as a new entrant, and I suppose explaining this to an international executive committee, the need for clarity around process and timings is absolutely critical to continue for long duration energy storage investors to invest in projects which have quite a long lead time. But on a positive note, I think we would absolutely welcome within Clean Power 2030 the separation of long duration energy storage and storage. They are two different things that offer two very different prospects to the market. So we would have welcomed the two different ranges for the two different technologies. With regards to the zones, we would think that there is a concern that there is a GB-wide zone for long duration energy storage, and that could result, I suppose, in a lost opportunity to really look to diversify the locations for long duration energy storage. In a UK context, when you think of long duration energy storage, you think of pumped hydro, but I think long duration energy storage is an umbrella term for a range of technologies, and certainly newer technologies that can be flexibly sited. I think the final point I would make is just with regards to how this fits in to support schemes, which, together with grid, together with land control, and together with the technical progression of the projects, is your development pathway, and how these projects can get to financial close. I think what we have seen is we see a very clear connection between CP or Clean Power 2030 and beyond, and grid reform, and we really welcome that. That's really good for any I suppose, international investor looking to the UK. It provides certainty and it provides a pathway to development. But there does seem to be one more step, and that's connecting that policy with the policy of CFDs, with the policy of cap and floor schemes, etc. One point we would make is that there's really positive initiatives like Project Designate that have come true in the grid reform, but there is a sequencing issue, because to be a project designate, you have to have received your long duration energy storage cap and floor scheme contract, yet to enter the cap and floor scheme or to be eligible to enter, you have to have your grid connection. So I think the final step for us is actually the logic linking of CP 2030, grid reform, and the various support schemes which underpin our ability to invest and continue early stage investment in projects in the UK.
Thanks, Oonagh. That's a really interesting perspective. Matt, at the end, I saw you nodding when John was mentioning kind of market interference. What's your view on how this is going to impact you?
Yeah, sure. So slightly pulled the short straw going last with my views on it all, but name's Matt Clare. I was one of the founders of Arlington. I've been in BES about 10 years, and a couple of years ago we were acquired into Masdar, who are the sovereign wealth of the UAE. So we have a portfolio of about 3 to 5 gigawatt hours in the UK across various projects ranging from sort of 20 meg to 500. So we kind of tick every different policy box there is. I agree with some of the comments on the panel. I think, first of all, Ofgem and NESO have done, maybe not a popular opinion, but I think they've done a lot of good work to swing the pendulum the other way. I think it needed swinging back. There was too many developers, not just in BES, across all sectors, just throwing in speculative applications, clogging up the system, making it very hard to actually sort out who's going to get these built. So it's not perfect, but and I understand the frustrations from a developer point of view, but developers are also slightly to blame in nicking all of the staff and resource that NISO and Ofgem seem to have as well. So I think that needs a mention. I do strongly agree with the, it feels weird that NISO deem themselves fit to have a view on how many of these storage systems get built. Ultimately, it should be market-led. We're going into the merchant markets. Simple supply and demand should sort out when investors stop building storage, and the more we build, the more it drives down costs for consumer. So it seems a weird thing to come in and say only this many can be built in this region. It feels like the investor's decision as to whether you do that or not. I think most of the other points have kind of been hit. There is a real policy gap between projects that sit at distribution level but are over 100 megawatts. We have some projects up to sort of 240 megawatts at distribution still, and they seem to fall between the cracks a little bit of the policy reform. But having said that, you know, Ofgem, NISO and everyone else had to step in and sort something out, so I'm sure every eventuality hasn't been covered yet and it will flow through. So I think that's probably...
Great, thank you. That's really, really helpful. Ali, is there anything there that you've not heard before as part of this kind of wider engagement?
No, I mean, like I said at the start, it's all been through a fairly fast but robust policy-making process. And you know, some may have contrary views to that, but there are no, I don't think there are any issues there that we're sort of unaware of. We'd expect to hear more back in response to the Minded to position that we set out on Friday. And yeah, frankly, it's the role of Ofgem, government and NISO to work together to ensure the new process is as robust and fair as possible in achieving the big picture outcomes that we need it to.
Okay, I think there's also the link there, Bex, isn't there, between planning and grid reform and the kind of increased pressure on what's an already very stretched system. You chair our planning working group. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Thanks for setting that up. Yeah, I think then making planning sort of the status that defines readiness feels particularly painful when I'm sure every developer here has been on the end of planning timescales and how that's delayed things. It's also particularly relevant for batteries with the England-Scotland different consenting regime splits. So the connections reform says if your planning was submitted by December and granted by when they do the assessment in May, you're a protected project. That works for a battery in England because they're taken out of the NSIP process. It doesn't work for a project in Scotland where the process is at least 12 to 15 months because of problems with resourcing.
Thank you. Matt?
I guess my view on all of this, though, is if I'm not ready, fundamentally, I shouldn't hold someone else up. It doesn't feel right to sit and moan about how much money I've spent on a project if someone else has spent their money on a project and they're ahead of us.
The fastest wins. It's a race, eh?
That kind of is the point of this reform, though, right? Like, and there has to be this barrier to entry of I can hold a 500 megawatt grid connection for 70 grand out the door. Do I have 250 million to go and build this thing? Most of the industry don't, is the reality. This is an energy storage conference, obviously, but there are lots of other sectors fighting for the same demand and export as well.
I think it's undoubtedly going to be a tough time for everyone over the next 12 months to see who is fast and who is not quite so fast. We're going to come out to questions now to the audience. I've seen some good questions popping up on Slido. Pleased to see one there on co-location, which I'd like to come on to. I'd really like to see some hands up, some audience participation after lunch. I'm sure you're all feeling a little sleepy, so yes. If there's a mic coming, please. Is there a mic? Or shall I? Okay, great. Yeah, there's a mic coming. And the next question, another hand, so we can get the next mic lined up. Okay, this gentleman in the second row. It's the next one.
Hello. Okay. Hi everyone, Shreya from Freeds. So with the reforms, so I think you've all come up with some, I guess, criticisms and sort of opinions on it, acknowledging we're in the final throes of the proposals with Ofgem's Mind 2 consultation. If there is one thing you would change that you think could feasibly change, what would it be?
Okay, that's a good question, because we've criticised it a bit, but what's the solution? Who wants to go first? We'll give me one solution and then we'll move on to the next person.
Bring back the £20,000 a megawatt.
So price, anyone else?
I didn't actually.
Yeah, I think the capacity maps need to consider system needs, so constraints, for example.
Okay, and Matt?
I think for me, it would be a review of the sequencing with the commercial pathways and market mechanisms, out-of-market mechanisms, to ensure that projects have a full trajectory path, having gone through this process to financial investment decision.
Okay, thank you. Matt, did you have a...
Yeah, I think the guillotine of 26 is a real issue. I have FID for a project now. If I want to order a power transformer, it's going to take 2 years from date of order. I think that hard and fast rule of anything that slips into even Jan 27 to connect, it's falling into a grey space that isn't actually very practical with how the industry works and supply chain works. Just nobody can build a 100 megawatt, 200, 300 megawatt project by that date, even if we have FID now.
Is that more of a risk for supply chain and the kind of lull before the kind of build-out happens?
It's just how long a power transfer, anyone that procures this sort of kit knows it comes with that lead time. So if you interpret the policy in a certain manner, projects that we could take FID now on, pay the next stage grid payment, pay 500-600 grand on, to hit order now, I wouldn't be on for 26. So it's not lining up with the reality of how long these projects actually take to build and take FID on.
So is there a risk there that the people with the bigger balance sheets that can forward order stuff and kind of ride out some of this are going to survive more than others? John, how's your balance sheet?
Yes. There's an elephant in the room that's linked to projects that have got grid connection dates that are 2026 that are going to be fully protected. They're not going to be deliverable in 2026, full stop. There's just simply not enough time. When you take into account the procurement timeframes, but equally, with the best will in the world, do not expect your confirmed grid connection date out of NESO anytime soon. They have to reevaluate all grid connections in the queue and reissue all grid connections. I know they've targeted the end of this year. I will be surprised if they meet that deadline for the majority of projects. They're going to have to do a phased approach. That's our opinion. But for the majority of projects, you're not going to be able to even think about getting to FID and starting procurement until at least probably the middle of next year.
Bex?
I really don't want to give Ali a hard time. I want to agree with what other people have said. I think the speed and urgency of which this has been done is recognised and appreciated. I guess you haven't answered the risk, or one thing that you would change. I'd be interested to know that.
Nothing.
Perfect.
No, in all seriousness, I think in an ideal world, more time. It would have been nice to have more time, I think, for these proposals to be developed. There is, however, a real need for speed, and I appreciate that won't be of comfort to some listening today, but the queue has grown astronomically. We have a need to decarbonise the system as quickly as possible. It was always going to be the case, unfortunately, that large-scale grid reform was going to create some winners, and unfortunately it was going to create some losers. Where we draw the line, where NESO draw the line and present their proposals to us for approval, has to be somewhere. And I think the proposals that have been brought to us as we set out in our Minded 2 position last week are we think they meet the objectives of connections reform, and give us the sort of best possible, or the best chance to achieve those objectives of Clean Power 2030 and all the benefits associated with decarbonisation, security of supply, and net zero for consumers.
Great, thank you. Second question, Steve?
Oh yeah, I could have a million questions having lived and breathed this hellhole of a life for the last 8 years, but I think one of them is, are we ever going to consider batteries an alleviant to grid reinforcement? And when will the SO speak to the DSO, and when does a DSO speak to a DNO? And surely we are missing the trick by just not looking at this holistic view of how BESS can alleviate the grid and not just be seen as a parasitic load and sit with all other generators.
It's an interesting concept, isn't it? People working together and talking to each other. There's a question in the second row there. If you could raise your hand again, so the lady with the mic. That's it. Just, sorry, just behind, 2 rows behind. There we go. I'll take one more question and then we'll come to that.
Hi, Chris Smith, Natural Power. On Friday's Minded 2 decision with the Gear 2 methodology, one of the alternatives was being proposed by Ofgem. Really just interested in what the panel's thoughts about that particular WACM of NISO providing more information after they've got all the initial information in. What do you think is a positive, and what would you expect to see in that?
Okay, thank you. So Ali, in terms of the end-to-end review, like how much kind of pressure are we going to put on networks to talk to each other and work together and have a kind of clear message back to industry?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So we've talked about connections reform today, which is about reforming the process, and frankly, puts more of a burden on the developer community. What the end-to-end review is looking to do is to make sure that the scales are sort of rebalanced and networks are appropriately held to account for their end of the bargain. So, you know, stricter regulations around meeting connection dates, stricter regulations around, you know, speed of network build, ambition of dates in connection agreements. That's going to be that's a sort of parallel piece of work to connections reform, and we've always said that we need the two together to achieve the right outcomes within connections. So, yeah, look out for our response on the end-to-end review middle of this year, where we hope to put more flesh on some of the proposals that were raised in the initial consultation.
Great, thank you. And so I'm going to ask my panel for final thoughts. I'm going to start with you, Matt. What are your final reflections you want everyone to take away today?
I think there's still a lot of work to do. I think we've made big strides in the right direction, and there's an element of kind of see how it pans out. Developers ultimately, I think we all enjoy a bit of risk, maybe not too much, but it does come with the title. And just a little bit more cohesion between, I think, to that question, between distribution, between transmission, facilitating that, because there are a lot of projects that are getting stuck at those levels, and people say the right things, take themselves off to have conversations, and then no solutions actually come out. So I think just more work to solve projects on a project-by-project basis between transmission and distribution would be good.
Great, thank you. Oonagh, your final thoughts?
I think my final thoughts, maybe just to the question that was asked in the audience, firstly, around the need to look at storage as a fundamental part of the transmission system. I think that is absolutely vital. Our project in Australia started its life as a reliability asset. That's where it got its revenue stream, its first revenue stream, and from there on built the revenue streams that we could therefore come close to financial investment decision this year on. So just to acknowledge that point. But I think with regards to final thoughts, it's about clarity of timing and a process. Because, for example, long duration energy storage cap and floor scheme participation opens in Q2 2025. We are part of the transitional offers process. It is critical to allow us have an opportunity to participate in that scheme, that we have clarity on timing and process and what we need to do as developers to hit that. So I think pace on both sides, but I think NISO and Ofgem have done a really good job on that to date. I think the continuation of that is needed, though, or there will be lost opportunities to satisfy system need.
Okay, thank you. John?
Yeah, just a quick one from me. It's not been mentioned so far. Everybody ends up being beholden to NGET, their wider grid reinforcement works, their delivery of new points of connection. I'd like to see the ability for ITNOs to get involved. We certainly have a proposal to build our own 400 kV substations. We can deliver those new points of connection in 2 years, not in NGET's 6-year timeframe.
Speeding things up, putting it in the private sector. Bex?
Thanks. It was just to go back to the question of sort of on what do you propose on slowing it down. And I don't think, I might get in trouble for saying this, but I don't think, by my company that is, it should be slowed down. I think the urgency is appreciated. But I don't think the sort of requirements to stay in were hard enough. I don't think you've cut down your queue enough here. And in the Minded to decision, it notes that the methodology will be updated regularly. So I think that's the way to, deal with these problems with the capacity maps, for example. But I think you're not going to narrow down your queue. I think the commitments needed to have been stronger. So why were the March grid security payments cancelled? That's just bonkers to me. If you want to see if someone wants to stay in, make them pay £200,000 for it. And then similarly with the commitments milestones, that sort of massively reduces your queue in the short term, while you can then look at the capacity maps, the constraints needs in the interim.
Okay, thanks, Bex. That's helpful. Ali, any final remarks from you?
No, you've probably heard enough from me. Yeah.
Brilliant. So I'd like to thank our panel in the usual way. You've been great, and time has zoomed by. So, and thanks to our audience too. So put your hands together, please, everyone.